Hello everyone, this is Steven again, and in this video I wanted to show very quickly how you can work with the gradient tool and create gradients in Adobe Animate. So this is a question that I get asked fairly frequently is, how do I apply a gradient? How can I modify that gradient on a shape? So I want to kind of walk through the steps of that. And first I'm going to point out that I set my interface back to the default essentials. So if you come over here, you can see essentials. If you also go to window and go down to workspaces, you can see it's set to essentials. But I'm going to be modifying the toolbox so that you can see the tools that I'm going to be using. And I'm just going to pull this off. I'm going to pull the tab. If you've watched my other videos, you can kind of see how I modify this. And I have a video that specifically goes into the process of modifying your toolbox. But if you click the three little dots here, you can see this drag and drop tools. And you will see that there's other tools that I can add to this toolbox, but there's also other tools that are sort of hidden underneath some of these. Where you see this little triangle in the corner, there's other tools underneath. So if I choose, say, the sub-selection tool, I can drag it over as long as this drag and drop tools is open. And then underneath the free transform tool by default is the gradient transform tool. So I could select that and just sort of drag it over and have it separate, so now it's not underneath one of these others. I can reset the whole thing. If I click reset, it's going to reset that, or I can set the interface to comfortable or compact, and I usually like it under the compact, and then I can close that, and you can see the tools are all here. If you don't particularly like that view, you can switch to comfortable, and that's going to make the icons a little bit bigger and make it a little bit easier to see, and then you can close that to work with it. So the more tools you add, you'll see that it'll add more divisions in between the tools so that they're kind of separate there. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. And an important one is that I'm going to be using the gradient transform tool. But the other thing that I wanted to bring up is this color swatch right here. It's very contextually sensitive. So depending on the tool that I'm using, when I select a color, it'll either use that tool for that color. So right now I have the paintbrush tool on and the fill color set to red. Or I had created an oval that was red, or I created this square that was blue. And before you use the tool, you can set that. But if you choose the selection tool, like if I select this and then I choose that swatch, you could see that I can change that, right? So that is very contextual. It's based on what I have selected and what I'm using at the time, right? So if I keep it, this kind of bluish purple, it's because I have it selected. If I don't have anything selected, if I change that, nothing is going to get changed, right? So if I choose one of the tools and I change that color, it's going to change that tool. So let's say, for example, I wanted to add a gradient to this instead of making it just the blue. I can click that little swatch and it's going to show me the fill color. You can adjust the alpha of that. I can change how it sits over another object if I wanted to. And if I have this on another layer, you would see the transparency as I kind of hover over that. And another thing to point out is if I just click once and I drag, you're going to see it leaves the outline behind. But if I double click, it's going to select both the line and the fill of that, right? But if I want to change that to a gradient, I can look down here and there's a couple different gradients. This first one's a linear gradient and the second one is a radial gradient. You can see when I hover over it, you can see how that's happening, right? So it's radial because it's going out from the center, right? And then if I choose this linear gradient, it's going from one side to the next, right? So, and one of the big questions that I get asked a lot is, how do I change this gradient? How do I change the colors? Well, you can't do it from this little swatch. I mean, I can choose some presets. This is all just about presets and colors. So I can make sure it's a linear gradient, and then I can come up over here and you'll see that there's a color icon. And this opens up this color panel, which will talk about the gradient. So currently selected is this linear gradient. You can kind of see that that's chosen from this little menu. You could also switch it to a radial gradient, but since this is set to linear right now, I'm going to keep that on that setting. Right below that is this flow. And if I check this, you see that it's called extend color. And what that means is extending color beyond the boundaries of the gradient, meaning that once it gets to white, it's going to keep going white. And then when it's dark here, it's going to keep going dark. And I'll talk about that when I use the gradient tool. The next one is reflect color. So it's just going to keep reflecting this gradient. And the third one is repeat color, which then repeats it. And when I show the gradient tool, I'll talk about that and you'll see how that works. Down here at the bottom is the gradient. And this is how I can assign colors to very specific areas. So right now it's white on one side, dark on the other. And that's reflected here in this shape. I can select this marker and then choose a color for that. So let's say I want to set it to green. And then you can see that I can change that marker and it's immediately reflected over here. So if I move this marker closer over here, I added a new one and I'll get to that. But if I move this marker closer, you can see how the gradient is changing, right? So if I want just a gradient right here, I can adjust that. And then I can change that color. Let's move it back and I'll just add a new one. And you'll see when I just hover the mouse over here, the pointer, you can see a little plus sign. So if I click there, it just adds a new one. This slider controls the brightness of the color. This over here chooses the hue and saturation. So saturation at the top, so how saturated the color is, how desaturated it is down here. And you'll see that down here is kind of white or gray, and that is determined by the brightness slider, right? And if I choose, between here and here, that is the hue. So this is saturation, this is hue or color, and this is the brightness of that color. Now this is when I'm using the HSB, hue, saturation, brightness values. If I switch to the red, green, and blue values, then this becomes a different slider where I can choose the color and saturation over here, and you can see that I have a different value depending on where I have that marker set. So I can choose the green value, the blue value, and here's that blue, and where I want to go from there. So each one of these has a negative and a positive. So in red, it goes from red to cyan, and then green, it's between green and magenta, and blue between blue and yellow, right? So that's how the red, green, blue values work. They're negative and positive, right? So I can adjust the red values, I can adjust the green values, and I can adjust the blue values, right? So a lot of people find that the hue, saturation, and brightness scales work a little bit better, right? So on hue, I can adjust the slider here for the hue going top to bottom. Saturation is from left to right, and the brightness is up and down. So that's usually the one that a lot of people work with, because here you can adjust the color, and here you can adjust the saturation and brightness. So this is going down less bright, and then desaturated or saturated. So that's how you can choose between those colors, right? And if I want to remove one of these markers for that color, I just drag it off and it's gone. I can keep adding more to add different values and different colors and make sort of this interesting rainbow effect on my gradient, right? And so I'm going to leave that there for right now. Not a very pretty thing, but at least it shows how we can gradate from different colors all throughout the shape. Now I'm going to choose the gradient tool. And if I select the shape with the gradient tool, you'll notice that you have a couple different markers here. You have a center position marker, which I can kind of move the gradient around, right? And I'm going to undo that. I can rotate the gradient, and then I can scale the gradient up and down, right? And this brings me back to these little icons right here, the flow. So the first one is extend color, meaning when it gets to the end of that marker, it gets to this marker, it just keeps going with that color. Same thing on this side, it gets to that color and it keeps going. And I'm going to choose a different color for this just so we can see that. So that's under this extend color. On the reflect color, what it's doing is it's going this direction and then it reverses. So it's like treating the gradient like it flipped over, right? It starts where it ends. And this one, the same thing. It starts where it ends and it goes back. It kind of wraps around. So that's reflect. Then repeat is it's cycling around. So this gradient goes from here to here and then repeats from here to here. So this blue is here and it just keeps repeating. So that's where you're going to see a very distinctive line unless you choose the same color on each side, right? So those are the differences between those three. Now the next one that I'm going to talk about is the radial gradient. And again, I'm going to go to the swatch and I'm going to go to a radial gradient and apply that radial gradient to the fill for that shape. And again, I can go over to the color and you can see that radial gradient is chosen, right? And it's not set to linear. And in the radial gradient, I have the same options here, but I also have the same sliders. So I can select that first marker, change the color, and you can see that gradient change, right? And it's kind of the same effect with these, but I'm going to go immediately over here to the gradient transform tool, and I'm going to scale this down, and you're going to see that it turns to an oval, right? And then I can move this little slider right here. It's this little arrow right here in the center, and I can slide it over, and I can move the center of that gradient off, right? So this is the center of the shape that represents the gradient, but I can slide it around. You can still see that it's gradating all the way to the edge, but since the center is moving, the gradation from here to here is a lot more than there is from here to here. So that's how you can kind of adjust that. So I'm going to leave it off center a little bit, and then I'm going to kind of pull this out. So I can go beyond, I can kind of bring it in. I can also scale the whole thing up, can scale it down, and I can rotate it, right? So I can have a gradient going that direction. I don't have to have it straight up and down. Now again, if I go to color, and I have those same options as flow options, I can choose reflect, and again, it's going to grade it out, like it's reflecting out from that. And kind of makes an interesting pattern because it's keeping that center closer to this side, right? And so if I want to kind of keep it centered there, then it looks more of like it's very centered in that shape. And then I can move it around and reposition that gradient. But again, go up to color, and I can choose this repeat color, which again does that same thing where it gradates out, and then it's going to the center out, right? So this one looks a little strange, but that's what it's doing, is it's repeating. So if you can kind of see in the center of that, there's a gradation, and then it keeps going out from there. So if I adjust this, you can see that it's kind of getting closer here, further away on this side. There are some circumstances where you might want to see something like this, depending on what it is. So I'm going to scale that down so you can kind of see how this is repeating. And again, I can choose the reflect, and it's going to reflect out from that, or I can just keep the color going, and so that I can just put a little highlight or something. So that's how you can use gradients, apply gradients to these shapes, and use that gradient transform tool on different shapes and come up with some interesting gradients for these shapes that you use in Adobe Animate. Good luck with it, and I hope it helps.